Your Royal Highness, thanks very much for being here this morning.
Good morning, Maria. Good to be back with you.
What do you expect will be this severe response that Iran is threatening?
Well, first of all, Maria, let's understand one thing. The regime is very weak and vulnerable day by day, and a lot of what it's done lately is mostly to satisfy its base for purposes of domestic consumption. When you come to think of it, we have a situation where Iranians today are facing official 45% inflation. Our currency has been devalued to up to 10,000 what it was at the time of the revolution. People are standing in lines for food and for fuel. Meanwhile, the regime has spent billions of dollars on a so-called missile arsenals, and all of it has gone to waste. And people are asking, why are we doing this? Why is Iran today selling cheap oil to China and the people are still starving? So these are all games to detract attention from what the focus should be on, which is the people of Iran itself. And of course, the regime is trying to avoid that. It's all part of the same tactic of deflecting attention while maintaining repression at home and still continuing their aggression abroad.
And you have been trying to fight for the Iranian people. I'm going to get back to this in a moment because I want to get your take on what catalyst it would take to get them to demand regime change. But let me first get your take on allies and a response from the United States. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says that the U.S. plans to impose new sanctions on Iran in the coming days. Watch this.
In discussions I've had, all options to disrupt terrorist financing of Iran continue to be on the table. We have been working to diminish Iran's ability to export oil. Clearly, Iran is continuing to export some oil. There may be more that we could do.
Reza, she's talking about all these options on the table. They've been on the table for years, and we're still talking about them being on the table. The Biden administration is facing backlash for extending this controversial sanctions waiver last month. It unlocked up to $10 billion in frozen money for Iran. Biden is also making a $6 billion prisoner swap deal with Iran. That, of course, as you know, happened last year. Your Highness, what do you think the Iranian leadership used all that money for? Were they planning an attack? Did they buy weapons and ammunition to attack Israel?
But that's exactly what I've been saying the last few months to media and other people, that that's exactly what's going to happen. When you have a regime that is going to use all of its revenue, not on the people of Iran, but to support its proxies, to get more money so they can do that, and of course be emboldened by this kind of appeasement approach, we should not be surprised that we have arrived at where we are today. From the Houthis to Hamas, we have the same problem regionally. This is not an exception. This is actually the behavior of a regime that from the very beginning had only one ambition, is to export its ideology, which is why I've been always saying that an expectation of behavior change has been the biggest flaw in Western countries' foreign policy vis-a-vis this regime and how to deal with it. The time, therefore, has come to understand that to put an ultimate end to the problem has to do with the disappearance of this regime. This actually is the ask of the Iranian people who are fed up with this system. Right. And I believe that by bringing additional pressure, it will facilitate that process of change. But there also has to be parallel to maximum pressure, which means more sanctions. There also has to be a parallel policy of maximum support to the people of Iran.
You really need the U.S. then to work with the people of Iran. I mean, look, let's talk about the path forward, because you want to tap into the people. What do you believe will be the catalyst that is needed, if not this? Because, look, we've talked before. Women stood up. They rose up after the murder of a wonderful young woman. And look where we are. They're still facing this incredible pushback and domination from the regime. So is there a catalyst that you see that is needed to encourage the people of Iran to stand up, to begin a countrywide demand for regime change?
Well, the demand is already there, but how do we get to that point? I think there are three basic and important components. The element of pressure from within can ultimately be nationwide labor strikes, which brings paralysis to the system. And it's the least costly way to the nation to do that, provided that they have adequate support. This is where the foreign component comes in. If there is a direct policy of maximum support to the people in various ways, it could be internet access, it could be funding labor strikes, and so on and so forth, that will create the impetus. But most importantly, when a strong message of leadership emanates from the outside world, it sends also a very strong message to elements that want out, that want to defect, that want to peel away from the regime. They need to have hope that beyond this regime, it's going to be a stable scenario. We're not talking about crisis. We're not talking about anarchy. And domestic leadership is important also. And the role that I'm trying to play in all of this is to provide that kind of interim leadership within a constitutional process that will let the Iranian people finally decide what they want. We need to work with leaders around the world, with leaders within Iran, to bring about this alternative in a concrete way. And when this alternative becomes more concrete for the nation, then they will be more comfortable in committing ultimately to an uprising and finally putting an end to this regime.
But as you say, the uprising needs a partner in the White House, needs, sanctions to be there, ultimate pressure to be there. I mean, give us your take on what has taken place throughout the Middle East in terms of Middle Eastern countries being forced to take a side. Under the Trump administration, the Abraham Accords was actually one area that people believed was the beginning of real peace that we could have seen throughout the Middle East. Do you see Middle Eastern countries now being forced to take a side after Iran's direct hit or attempted hit on Israel?
Well, I think there has been a growing frustration in the region for the lack of action, or better say weakness, emanating from the West, and particularly from the United States. I cannot think for a second that somebody like Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh, or for that matter, his Israeli counterpart in Jerusalem, will think that now we have to completely shift our viewpoint as to what the role of the Islamic regime is in the area. However, in order for this to happen, there has to be much stronger leadership coming from the West. Washington is key, and of course some key European countries as well. They need to be able to work together. I think that solidarity is very important, because that's exactly what the regime had tried to do in its tactic, some kind of a divide and rule game. This is a time for the world to show very unconditionally that they are not going to put up with this regime behavior any longer. This regime has had over 4 decades time to behave and to come true. It hasn't, only because it cannot.
Yeah.
It's not in its DNA. That needs to be understood, by the way. Meanwhile, however, you have the most natural ally in the Iranian people as boots on the ground, so to speak, who have the very same values and the very same desire that America champions in the name of freedom and human rights. You are talking about not throwing your allies under the bus yet again. This is an opportunity that the world has right now to avoid further conflict, escalation, and God knows what could happen as a consequence. We have the option right now. So beyond being on the table, Maria, take it off the table and implement it.
That's right. Well said. Reza Pahlavi, good to see you, sir. Thanks very much. We'll be watching.
Thank you, Maria.